You would please take your seats. We will begin this minute. And for the session this afternoon, post 9/11 global consequences, please welcome your chairman, Datuk Dr. Muhammad Ghazali Haji Mat Noor, the senior adjunct Tindakan Strategi Sdn Bhd, Professor Dr. Hans Kirchler, University of Innsbruck, Austria, Mr. Giulietto Cisa, former member of EU Parliament. He's an Italian politician. And of course, Dr. Chandra Muzaffar, President of the International Movement for a Just World. Over to you, Dr. Ghazali.
Thank you, Madam. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are now in the session 3 of this important international seminar on 9/11 Revisited. The third session talks about the consequences of such a global agenda for all of us across the world. As you may recall today, that the 9/11 today is not in history. You may discover today, if you Google down, there are certain articles that still talk on the recent phenomenon. As we know, the perpetrator of 9/11 began in New York. Many of us today may not realize that 6/11 also becomes a good reminder of what 9/11 is about. It was only 2 weeks ago when the great power elected a new president. But 3 days before that, divine forces invaded that nation in the eastern region that housed the Wall Street and the Main Street. For those who know eschatology and those guided by divine heart will know the implications of such messages. What if the event happens on the 6th of November? For those who are students of history, great empires are visited by calamities beyond technical rationality. Great leaders commit great sins of imperpetuity of immorality of the leadership trusteeship. There is one lesson today. And in Kuala Lumpur today, in this part of the emerging world, Kuala Lumpur stands at the opposite of Washington, D.C., and other capitals of other nations to speak again. It is very momentous for all of us to understand, fellow Malaysians, and all of us in this hall, that the debate on 9/11 is not a historical relic. For those who know, 9/11, in our understanding, is the architecture of the future war. President Reagan brought the Star Wars. Today, the cyber war is on your mark. For those who are students of history, the 3 landmark change of the international reclassification of the boundaries of nations. One was by the land, second was by the sea. Today, if anything, 9/11 tells you they are going in the outer space. So be warned that the 9/11 today, war will be fought through ICT, where knowledge today is not mere historical knowledge, but today it is why the question was asked by Mr. Ryan Johnson, why did Israel betray America? Dr. Bruno Tetres said, what are the strategic and geopolitical consequences of 9/11? As what mentioned by our lady from India, the US drone strikes of backward nations and modern nations. So said William Blum of the Foreign Policy Journal. And finally, the 9/11 watershed event, towering infernos, flash flags, and the global war on terrorism are those questions being asked. But today we are addressing, ladies and gentlemen, the consequences of 9/11 and what Frank Mosel, who was an Episcopal priest, said, the truth of 9/11 will set us free. So he said in the global research has risen on 3rd September 2012. Mr. Mahmoud Al-Hassan of Pakistan says about the emerging geopolitical and geostrategic trends in the Middle East, a case study. And he refers to Syria, as was alluded to our friends. And how September has changed the US economy. Retrospective explores how long-term economic consequences of 9/11. And indeed, in the recent Geopolitical Weekly, consequences of the fall of the Syrian regime by George Friedman. And of course, the last one that was alluded about CIA as the mastermind of global friendly relations against the world, the Petraeus Affair versus CIA long criminal history by Julie Levesque of Global Research, how his butcher is his stance on how Israel, we saw, has a liability US interest in the Middle East. Today, ladies and gentlemen, the world is not a bipolar of two powers. It is a multipolar. It was alluded today that the world of tomorrow will be economic powers. And we have emerging nations and emerging continents. They are called the BRICS. They are called Latin America. They are called Africa. And they are also called the Semi-BRICS, which consists of the big four Muslim nations of potential, which is Saudi Arabia, Ankara, Turkey, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the three evolving nations, Pakistan, Nigeria, and Egypt. And of course, we have in our backyard, ASEAN has a bulwark of economic growth. To discuss all these issues, ladies and gentlemen, we are fortunate to have with us Professor Hans Keller on my right, who is a professor of philosophy at University of Innsbruck in Austria. Second, we have from European Parliament and Italian Parliament, who spoke just now, and he is Mr. Giulietto Kiscia. And of course, our national representative is Dr. Chandra Muzaffar, President of the International Movement for the Just World. We will have for 1.5 hours this afternoon, and therefore I took this deliberation to request my esteemed members of the panel to represent the paper within 20 minutes, because we are going for the bigger issue where all of you in this hall would have the moral responsibility to ask the panel, what shall we go next? Because I said in my introduction, the 9/11 is not a historical relic. Actually, it's just the beginning of a new century of civilization, benign or good for mankind. So now I'll call upon Professor Hans to begin his presentation, sir. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I will speak about 9/11, hubris of power, and the geopolitics of war. That is my provisional title for this presentation, and I hope that I manage with the time given to us. First of all, one may describe the consequences of the 9/11 events for global order in a factual manner, which I'll do in a moment. However, in order to properly understand them, we have to pay attention to developments that preceded those events. So I see a connection or a relation between this aspect of post-September 11th analysis and pre-September 11th analysis. Let's just recall very briefly. In the years following 1989, and a reference has been made by the chairman, we have witnessed the collapse of the bipolar balance of power. This event or this development was heralded as dawn of a so-called New World Order, and we recall in that regard the triumphalist speech of President George Bush Sr. after the end of major military operations against Iraq in the spring of 1991. The new geopolitical strategy at that historical moment in 91 apparently was, on the part of the US, to preserve the hegemonial position it had obtained and to eternalize this new unipolar power constellation after the collapse of, unexpected by most, collapse of the socialist bloc. The events of the year 2001 have, in the most dramatic fashion possible, I would say, provided an opportunity for this new hegemonial power to demand obedience from all in a kind of self-proclaimed global endeavor, which was presented to us, to the international public, as a fight against evil. And the motto at that time was, spoken by George Bush, the son, you are either with us or against us. Tertium non datur. There is no other, no third possibility. A fitting narrative was produced with almost lightning speed after, or in the course even, of that day, September 11th, 2001, although, of course, that narrative was, as we have been told this morning, rather absurd and totally irrational. I think this would be the events of this day and how they have been covered and how they have been presented to the world public and how the world public reacted. That would really be a case study for, I would say, the biggest mass psychological event since the era of World War II. The UN Security Council was brought along within days, and it issued a kind of general authorization for the use of force. And eventually, and I cannot go into the details here, it was also, I mean, the Council was also subscribing to the US narrative. And as far as I can see, the pressure to conform at the collective and individual levels was never as strong in recent history as it was in that particular constellation. A critical analysis, or if one wants to use a modern term in philosophy, a deconstruction of this official narrative is therefore absolutely essential if one wants to understand the consequences of the events more than 10 years ago. And that is the reason why it is so important that one insists on the creation of, or that one insists on an independent and impartial investigation. Also, in view, by the way, of the almost total failure of the mainstream media in their role as the so-called fourth estate. Let me now come quickly to the consequences, medium and long term, in regard to the global political constellation, because that is the main focus of this afternoon session. And I will mention, let me see, 4 or 5 aspects, and I hope I manage with the time. First, an aspect in terms of psychology, or one could also say the climate of international relations in general. What we have seen, or what we have witnessed, and some speakers refer to it in the morning, is a kind of entrenchment of an enemy stereotype vis-à-vis Muslims or Islam as a religion. And this kind of entrenchment of that stereotype has made it very difficult for many, including even decision makers at the highest level I have spoken to in Western Europe has made it so difficult for them to relate to the Muslim world in a rational and objective manner. The climate of international relations has been poisoned, one could say, in that regard. And we should not be surprised that psychologically it is very difficult for an individual to overcome the irrational fear that goes with that stereotype. This fear is also being exploited, as we have seen in the meantime, not only in the US, also in other countries, for purposes of domestic politics. One could also say, as far as the Muslim world is concerned, that it has been the victim of a kind of collective character assassination, while the rest of the world, and in particular, I mean the Western world, is, one could say, hostage of a self-inflicted prejudice. So this fog of suspicion is somehow over world affairs, and it has rather substantially changed also the way in which international affairs are conducted. Second aspect, very quickly. I mean, the fact is that the bipolarity of the Cold War era has been transformed into a unipolar constellation at the beginning of the 1990s, a unipolar constellation in terms of political and military power. But at the same time now, and this is the aspects in terms of relations between civilizations and their impact on geopolitics. At the same time, a new kind of global bipolarity has been shaping up, which is parallel, which relates to the relations between civilizations. And one could say that the clash of civilizations people began to speak about at the end of the Cold War has really been made a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. And I do recall a discussion I had here in private with Samuel Huntington, I mean here in this city in Kuala Lumpur, in the middle of the 1990s, about that, I mean about the implications of this paradigm of the clash of civilizations. And he was certainly much more optimistic than I was at that time. Unfortunately, my concerns finally have proven to be having been a little more accurate. Third aspect in this review of the consequences relates to what I would call perpetual war, because that is what the so-called global war on terror means. As a result of these events in 2001, a kind of a situation of fear and shock has been created among the general population, and this has been exploited, and references have been made here earlier, for military expeditions, and particularly for interventions in the Muslim world, Afghanistan and Iraq and so on, in order to ensure permanent control over one of the most important and sensitive geopolitical regions. And I shall not go here into details. Wars have been conducted and are still being conducted under false pretexts as in Afghanistan as well as in Iraq, and wars are being conducted nowadays with this flavor of a crusade, although, as Prime Minister Dr. Mahathir said, that term has been, President Bush has been reminded that he should, for tactical reasons, not use that term in his official speeches. Fourth aspect relates to the international rule of law. What we have seen, and I think this is quite obvious and nothing special, is the most serious erosion of the international rule of law since, I would say, the fascist era in the last century. What do I mean by that? As far as the ban on the use of force is concerned, which is one of the basic principles of modern international law, this ban on the use of force is now being completely neglected by reference, constantly being neglected by reference to the events of 9/11. And of course, this only works because of the false narrative that is given for these events. And just to give a rough list very quickly, what I mean is the Afghanistan invasion, which began in 2001, the Iraq war in 2003, more recently the Libya war last year in 2011, but in addition to that, all the practices which in an earlier era would have been considered totally unacceptable, like the so-called extrajudicial killings, which means assassination attacks by means of remotely controlled planes in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, and so on. Also, one has to list here the torture of so-called terror suspects, which also has become now a kind of routine procedure, the secret renditions of supposed terror suspects, not only undertaken, mainly undertaken by the United States, but in collusion and with the cooperation of some of the major allies, also including not only client states somewhere outside of Europe, but also including some of the long-standing member states of the North Atlantic Treaty. And what one should also not overlook here in this context are the fake judicial procedures which are conducted under the title or have been initiated under the name of the military tribunals. All these acts are, strictly speaking, international crimes, and according to the treaties and instruments of today's body of international law. And all these acts reveal what I would call the arbitrariness of power, or more generally, of course, a state of international lawlessness. And it should not surprise us that this has, as far as the international system is concerned, a kind of demoralizing effect on the community of states. How can one expect other states to abide by the rules, by the rules of the law, if the most powerful actor himself acts illegally? And in that regard, it's a real irony that just a few weeks ago, around the middle of September, the United Nations General Assembly held a special so-called high-level meeting on the rule of law at UN headquarters. I think this is a mission impossible for the United Nations General Assembly to try to uphold the international rule of law under these circumstances. Fifth aspect I briefly want to deal with relates specifically to the United Nations organization as the universal international institution, intergovernmental body. First of all, the UN, in my assessment, as a result of these developments, is being made increasingly dysfunctional. Its authority is constantly being undermined by the unilateral action of the most powerful member state. Examples of this trend, just in a telegraphic style now, to be brief, the use of the Security Council as a kind of legitimizing tool for wars that are effectively coalition wars, such as those expeditions against Afghanistan, Iraq, and most recently, Libya. So what I mean is effectively unilateral uses of force are being, or the United Nations is used, we can say it like this, to legitimize uses of force which are effectively unilateral, but in the guise of multilateral structures. Further on, the instrumentalization of the United Nations Security Council for an elusive and perpetual global war on terror. The role of the Security Council as, and this is, for instance, evident in this new role which the Security Council has assumed, very strangely, as a kind of ad hoc court for terror suspects and the organizations which are related to those terror suspects. And what I mean here is how the so-called 1267 Committee of the Security Council operates. And the fact is that the Council acts as prosecutor, judge, and executor at the same time. This is total arbitrariness and a total contradiction to the principles of the rule of law, which requires a division of powers. And all of that is done by way of totally secretive procedures with the involvement, with the use of information that is provided essentially by intelligence services of interested states. And one could therefore say that the United Nations organization in this way, if it is being used in such a way, and that's the reality, the United Nations organization, in spite of the noble efforts of the General Assembly's president, undermines the very rule of law it is supposed to uphold. And as a systemic consequence, one could mention here that the ban on the threat and use of force, I mean Article 2, Paragraph 3 of the UN Charter, is being made ineffective. And one must have no illusions. The provisions of Chapter 7 of the Charter concerning the enforcement of the basic principles and of the ban on the use of force, these provisions have no deterrent effect vis-à-vis a veto-wielding member state that is able to operate outside a balance of power anyway. And this means that a new approach is taking gradually hold in the UN system, namely that of anything goes in the name of the war on terror, and also and this also means that whatever is being done in the name of this battle is being forgiven and is not being scrutinized. And what we see here is a kind of de facto reintroduction of the old jus ad bellum, the law to wage war, which we thought we had already overcome and abolished and abrogated forever. And that brings me to my concluding remarks, namely that it is only too obvious that these events of 2001 have brought about a sea change in international affairs, and that they have had a lasting negative impact in terms of the global power constellation. In fact, we have seen a kind of regression towards an earlier era of international anarchy, such as it existed in the 19th century power politics, with the arbitrary rule by whoever is the most powerful actor. And as I said initially, the pressure to conform collectively also, as far as state behavior is concerned, has never been greater since the era of European fascism. And one could also speak here of mention here a kind of what I would call Machiavellian blueprint of a world order built on disinformation and resulting from it, of course, fear that in turn is meant to produce obedience. And those who challenge this strategy are becoming targets of psychological warfare. So there will be a campaign of disinformation aimed at those who dare to question the implausible and intrinsically false narrative. And we should not be surprised that most people fear, for that reason, even to ask the right question. And they fear, as I have seen so often in many discussions also with people in political positions, they fear to use their own intellect because they try to avoid by all means that label of conspiracy theorists. So we really have arrived in this Orwellian world of mind control. Just two final points concerning power and the geopolitics of war in this new constellation. First, regarding the dynamics of power, what I would say as someone who tries to analyze the situation in terms of philosophy is that what characterizes power is always that insatiable drive or urge for an increase in that very power and control over others, and per se such a tendency is opposed to what we call a balance of power. That means it is opposed to the sharing of power with other competitors. And that leads me to the second aspect in that regard, namely the psychology of power and this aspect of hybris, which I mentioned initially. An unexpectedly achieved advantage, and I mean by this the sudden disappearance of the adversary, the Soviet Union, the socialist bloc, the beginning of the 90s, is misinterpreted as a sign of one's own strength, and that leads to a kind of megalomaniac attitude, and that is somehow connected with the temptation to eternalize this advantageous position. And that's the mindset within which one would then begin to speak about one's state as the indispensable nation, and so on. So what we see nowadays is a renaissance of a geopolitics of war, where the use of armed force is reintroduced as an extension of politics. That means as a legitimate means to advance the so-called national interest, according to the famous dictum, one could say, of the 19th century German strategist von Clausewitz. And just to recall it in the English version, war is merely the continuation of policy by other means. That is the dictum of von Clausewitz. It is to be hoped, I would say, that this legacy of 9/11 will ultimately be challenged by the real international community, not by the self-styled one, namely the US and her allies. And by this real international community, I mean the peoples who the UN Charter refers to in its preamble as those who are determined to build peace through human rights and justice, not through fear, subjugation, and war. In the post-September 11th constellation, the geopolitics of war has to be challenged by A, confronting the global hegemon with truth. That means by establishing a truthful record of the events on that fateful day about which we speak here, and B, by concerted action of civil society in the Muslim and Western worlds in particular, to re-establish mutual trust, which is not possible without the knowledge of truth. I'm aware that this is an enormous undertaking that requires courage of political leaders and an unwavering commitment to justice and cooperative action on the part of all the members of our global civil society. And I wish the Perdana Global Peace Foundation all the success in that noble effort, in that noble undertaking. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Han, for your elaborative framework in terms of the geopolitical redefinition of a new world order to revisiting the 19th century Machiavellian model. Have I said earlier, the world powers have changed. It is no longer land, it is no longer money. Today is real power through technology. And the opportunity of the social media, of which the general populace of all the world, through the internet and all other social media, can be a force to be reckoned with. If all of us undertake such initiative to convince the world that we have a mutual destruction of the world if we do not confront this new single power that is re-engineering the relations among nations today. Now we will call our colleague from Italy, Mr. Giulietto Gesa, to present his views.
Thank you very much. It is difficult to overestimate the importance of this international conference, and I thank very much Dr. Mahathir Mohamad and the Perdana Global Peace Foundation for that. 11 years have passed since that tragic September 11, 2001, that changed the history of the world. All these years, we have been at war against international terrorism. A fifth of George Bush prophecy made a few hours after 9/11 has already come true. In fact, the then United States President said that a war is beginning which will last 50 years. Singular prophecy indeed, a revealing one. Since then, not a single terrorist has been found and sentenced in a regular trial. You could say that they are all dead. Maybe. In any case, no one has been charged. Some of them are in prison, but have not been judged. Even Osama bin Laden was never charged of the 9/11 events. The only new thing is that he has been killed in May 2011 for the 6th or 7th or 8th time. During all this time, we have met his image on the TV screens like an ectoplasm. Now, he is not any more useful and has been discarded, but the war is going on. The world has been told a story that does not stand the slightest verification. They told us that donkeys fly, and billions of people, this is a problem. Billions of people believe till now that donkeys fly because they have the full control of the media mainstream. And this is the most worrying circumstance because it means that they can and they will manipulate minds and hearts in the next years. They needed a new enemy to be created. The empire was entering a huge crisis with no way out, but they could not admit it, nor they could allow that the crisis became visible to everybody. Such an epiphany would have shown to the world that the empire could no longer control a new landscape where 1,000 desert of the Tartars was already surrounding his strongholds. The empire was, and is, deadly ill. It found a new enemy to cement the West around the United States, as the Soviet communism did during the Cold War. And the enemy was created with a masterful, monstrous show, Islam. And they won. No doubt they won. The endless war began, and we have seen the first 3 chapters: Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya. The 4th, Syria, is on the printing. 3, 4 wars which are going on are not yet finished. But for them it is not a problem. For them it is important not to win them, it's important to produce disorder and multiply fear. The next greater war is on the move against Iran. It is ready to start to the smallest detail. Every square inch of the Iranian territory has been mapped, and every dip in the ground was measured to allow cruise missiles to hit the underground targets. Tactical nuclear warheads will be used for that. They only need a pretext, and they will create it when the time will come. The Israeli rulers have already fixed the meeting for the next summer at large, when they will tell the world that Iran has the capability to make the bomb. And the 5th war will be done by the vindicator, the final killer of Osama bin Laden, the Peace Nobel Prize in advance, Barack Obama. Now it is time to say who they are. The best definition I found is coming from Paul Krugman, Master of the Universe. It describes them perfectly, even if Mr. Krugman certainly does not share my point of view about 9/11, which I understand because I am not a Nobel Prize in economy. They indeed were master of universe. But now they cannot control the universe anymore. This is their problem. And unfortunately, our problem too. There is, for instance, China, that they cannot dominate. Moreover, there are 6 billion people who today or tomorrow will not accept their domination. The balance of power has shifted dramatically, radically, in the last 10 years. The others, who are now strong enough to do it, do pretend to have their own piece of the pie, especially now when it is becoming clear that the ruler is not so reliable as it was in the past. And it is not only a matter of the others coming on the scene, not because they became wiser or smarter, simply because there are not enough resources. We are making a mistake when we believe that the crisis is only financial crisis. It's not only financial crisis. There are 5 or 6 big, huge, unprecedented crises going to the point of no return in the same time in the next 20 years. Food, water, energy, climate change, energy, for everybody in a world growing like they are dictating till now. There is no place for all these people. You need an endless war if you pretend to have an impossible endless growth. I would say, quoting Michael Moore, it's physics, not politics, stupid white man. September 9/11 was their victory, but a Pyrrhic one. The result was indeed only such a kind of delay. They delayed the explosion for 7 years. And in 2008, it reappeared, 10, 20 times bigger than that which began in 2000 with Enron Corporation collapse or the dot-com bubble. What they wanted to hide then re-emerged with a virulence that was not possible to hide anymore. The contagion they spread has infected all the West. I don't say all the world, I say all the West, the golden billion. Now the engine is engulfed by a gigantic amount of virtual money, which is in fact a real debt of states and of families. And they have not any idea of how they can continue to dominate not the world, but just their world. Here we are. There is nobody able to pay the bill. Even the United States cannot pay the bill, when the GNP of the world is 20 times lesser than the amount of the derivatives volume. And they are continuing in pouring new virtual money. The Federal Reserve makes it, the European Central Bank makes it, the Bank of England makes it, the Bank of Japan makes it. It is the illusion of the quantitative easing. They, in fact, don't have another solution. They don't have any other solution. But this will mean in the short run that the US Treasury certificates will be no longer the safe haven they have been in the last 50 years. The safe haven for every storm where the default would have been impossible forever. The most secure place to save your money is suddenly becoming the most unsafe place in the world. The question is that the big machinery of development created with the globalization has stopped, and they have not another similar machine. The development achieved and exploited by the West in the last 3 centuries of human history has gone and will not be reproduced because there is an unescapable principle of physics. An infinite growth in a finite system of resources is simply impossible. We are facing limits of resources. The limits of resources are the limits of growth. We can try to prolong the agony producing virtual money, but it will simply produce a gigantic collapse. There is theoretically, very theoretically, a second option. Come to terms with the dominated in the past, beginning negotiation with them is another word. Recognizes that the balance of power shifted already toward East, accepting equal rights for all. But this option would require a huge change of mentality and of perspective. It would require such a Copernican revolution in their minds that I believe they are not capable to do, because it lays outside and beyond their mental horizon. What will happen, we don't know. Nobody knows. Neither those who have created this conundrum, because they remain arrogant and they want to dominate furthermore, nor their victims, that means we, blackmailed, subdued, deprived even of the illusion of democracy. Therefore, the most probable outcome will be either a guided, planified collapse of the financial system, which will burn out the gigantic burden of the virtual money, or a war, a big war, which they think will burn the entire building of the biggest trick of human history. The most worrying aspect of this scenario is that they believe that they will survive. They and their families and their friends. Who they are is now clear. They are the 9 bankers. The New York Times told us 2 years ago that we are secretly gathering somewhere in Manhattan to decide every month the fate of 800, 900 trillion of derivatives all over the world. The names are clear: Citigroup, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Deutsche Bank, Credit Suisse, Barclays, Union de Banque Suisse. They are the 16 bankers that every day at 11 o'clock decide in London the so-called London interbanking borrowing rate. They are huge states without a territory, like BlackRock or Barclays, which has a portfolio bigger than the GDP of Germany. All these people and their friends and their servants were in power in 2001 and are still in power now. No illusion, please. When we gather to study 9/11, to research the truth, to understand what happened 11 years ago, we are not making a kind of remainder of the past. Those who conceived 9/11 are in power. They are powerfully armed. They feel themselves in danger. They will try again. Therefore, we are watching the future. What will happen in the next years? Maybe in the next months, look at Gaza, Lebanon. Maybe in the next months, in any way, in the short run, we are discussing the survival of our children. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Giletto, for your insight from the European concern about the traditional Anglo-Saxon power broker nightmare today, which you live in Italy and the rest of the world. Today we'll have the Asian voice. Mr. Chandra this afternoon will speak on behalf of Emerging Asia. Dr. Chandra.
Chairperson Dr. Ghazali, fellow panelists, guests, Assalamu alaikum, Salam Sejahtera, peace be with you. I'd like to begin by thanking the Pradhana Global Peace Foundation for this very kind invitation. Let me at the outset express my very profound appreciation to Dr. Mahathir Mohamad for taking this initiative. It is an act of tremendous courage and integrity. As others have observed, leaders in power would not want to do a thing like this. But the fact is that leaders who are no longer in power also wouldn't dare to do a thing like this. So I think this is something which is commendable. All of us here, Malaysians, should be very proud that we have a person like Dr. Mahathir in our midst who's prepared to do a thing like this. Because there are risks, without any doubt at all, for taking an initiative of this sort. Friends, you know the way in which public discourse is shaped by certain events. All of us talk of 9/11, and we have a certain 9/11 in mind. That's because this particular 9/11 had impacted upon the most powerful nation on earth. And so it impacts upon all of us. But we forget that there are two other 9/11s in history that we should also remember from time to time. One is the 9/11 that happened in 1973. 11th of September, the assassination of Salvador Allende of Chile, a democratically elected leader who was overthrown, assassinated. That's also on a 9/11. There's another 9/11 in history. 11th of September, 1901, when Mahatma Gandhi launched his Satyagraha movement in South Africa, non-violent resistance to power. But these are 9/11s that we don't remember. But let us, because of our theme this afternoon, concentrate on this very well-known 9/11. I began to have doubts about the official narrative on 9/11 just a couple of days after the event happened. And what was the reason? the media, including the Malaysian media, had at once come to the conclusion that the person responsible for 9/11 was Osama bin Laden. It was just amazing. No inquiry, no investigation, no attempt to find out the truth. All of a sudden, there was this person who was shown on TV over and over again as the person behind 9/11. And I could sense that there was something really fishy about this. Over the years, in the last 11 years, from the things I've read, the people that I've met, and from the very rich presentations we have had this morning, I'm more convinced than ever that we should make it our mission, our life's mission, to find out the truth about this very critical event in history, 9/11 of 2001. There are 7 consequences which struck me as important in looking at 9/11, apart from all the other consequences that were mentioned this morning. Number 1, the significance of 9/11 lies in the fact that it gave birth to the war on terror, which in turn impacted upon the relationship between 2 civilizations as never before, Western civilization and the Muslim world. It reinforced the stigmatization of the Muslim world, its association with violence and terror, which is not something that began with 9/11. It has a 1,000-year history behind it. Associating Islamic civilization with violence and terror has a long, long history behind it. It would interest us to know that when the European princes and the religious elites in Europe were conducting crusades in order to liberate Jerusalem, some of the literature, especially the religious literature that appeared at that time, castigated Muslims as violent people, when actually the violence associated with the crusades was unspeakable. They killed not just Muslims. In fact, they killed more Jews than Muslims in the crusades. And they killed Christians in the crusades, which is seldom highlighted. The Christians of Constantinople were massacred by the crusaders from Europe. So this was an example of violence, but somehow that violence was transferred to the victim. And this has gone on. You commit violence, you transfer it to the victim and say the victim is the one who is violent. And the classic example in our time is, of course, Palestine and what has been happening over and over again, especially in the last few days. Who are the violent ones? As far as the mainstream Western media and so much of Western society is concerned, the violent people are the Palestinians, when actually we know that they are the victims of violence. The real perpetrators of violence are somehow presented in a different light. So this is a long history behind it, and 9/11 reinforced that. Number 2, 9/11 also reinforced the pursuit of hegemony. Hegemony during the Cold War had a certain rationale behind it. It was somehow the defense of the free world. But after the end of the Cold War, they needed to continue with their hegemony. So you create a new enemy, a point which a number of people have made this morning. And the new enemy is Islam or the Muslims, but also China. If you look at Huntington had talked about both these 2 new enemies that one had to confront. But in the case of the Muslim world, Afghanistan, the first target, and then of course Iraq, and one can argue Somalia and Iran, directly or indirectly, somehow related to the whole question of terrorism and of violence. But what it camouflages is not just the attempt to control oil and gas. There's something else as far as hegemony is concerned. it is to control sea routes. 8 of the 10 most important waterways in the world border the shores of Muslim countries, including the Straits of Malacca here, which is why they're also interested in regime change in Kuala Lumpur, because that would give them greater control over the Straits of Malacca. The Straits of Hormuz, the Suez, you look at all the major waterways, they are somehow linked to the Muslim world. So if you want to be a hegemonic power, you need to control these, just as you have to control oil and gas. And you want to control this, and this brings me to the third point I want to make, because some Muslims choose to resist, which is why you want to control. If they were not willing to resist, if they were prepared to play the game with you, there would be no problem. The biggest oil exporter in the world, Saudi Arabia, is prepared to go along with hegemonic power. So the Saudis are not a problem. But when you resist, it becomes a problem. And it doesn't matter whether you are a religious leadership, a very orthodox, perhaps even atavistic religious leadership, it doesn't matter. Or if you're very secular, it doesn't really matter. The important point is resistance. The best example of this is Iran. Iran under Mossadegh resisted the British and the Americans. They had to get rid of him. He was secular. He was a nationalist. Iran under Khomeini resisted the West. And so they have continued to undermine Iran, religious. So it's not whether you're religious or secular. In fact, it does not even matter whether you're Muslim or something else. It's resistance. We've forgotten to highlight an area which has been subjected to US hegemony and which has resisted for so long. And that's the resistance they've been trying to delegitimize all along. It's Latin America. Look at the way they've treated Cuba. 26 known attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro. That's the price of resistance. How they treat Venezuela, or Bolivia, or Nicaragua. So resistance is what the hegemon cannot accept. They have to delegitimize resistance. One way of delegitimizing resistance is to link it with violence. Because sometimes when you resist, you resort to force. For those under occupation, we know that resisting occupation through force is legitimate in international law. But nonetheless, you have to delegitimize their resistance. And this is the way to do it. You link it with violence, which is why we know that Ariel Sharon was prime minister at that time, 2001. Ariel Sharon was very, very keen on the official 9/11 narrative. To what extent he was responsible, we don't know. Something that one has to establish. But for him, it was delegitimizing the Palestinian resistance. It was saying, look, these Palestinians are terrorists, and telling the Americans, you also have a problem with terrorists, we have a problem with terrorists, this is 9/11, our bond of blood. It brings us together. And this, I think, is what is so dangerous about the official 9/11 narrative. An attempt to delegitimize legitimate movements against hegemony. Friends, there is yet another dimension to this. As a result of 9/11, a whole lot of militant groups have emerged in the Muslim world. I'm not referring to the legitimate resistance movements, all sorts of other groups. The most significant of them would be, of course, groups that are seen as allied to Al-Qaeda, with all sorts of names, and not just in West Asia, also in South Asia, Southeast Asia, these militant groups have emerged. And in a sense, some of them have given a bad name to Islam, these militant groups, because they do indulge in senseless, mindless violence, which we should condemn. It is wrong. It's something that is unacceptable. But that's, again, one of the consequences of 9/11. And that brings me to yet another consequence of 9/11. Some of these groups are being manipulated, without any doubt at all, being manipulated by the centers of power in the West. They may be linked to the CIA, to Mossad. We don't know what other intelligence units that they are linked to. And that manipulation is very active. We have seen it in the last couple of years. Look at Libya. Some of the so-called jihadists were sponsored, openly admitted in certain media circles, sponsored by the centers of power in the West, intelligence outfits, and so on. Look at Syria. Look at the active involvement of intelligence outfits from the West, including the United States of America, in Syria. Since March 2011, actually, if you look at the role of Saad Hariri and the role of Banda Sultan and the way in which they had financed and sponsored terrorist groups in Syria. Because that's part of the larger agenda, fighting against a leadership, whatever its shortcomings may be, and there are many shortcomings with the Bashar al-Assad government. Whatever its shortcomings, we cannot run away from this fact that these jihadist groups and other militant groups who are all over the place in Syria now, they are fighting against a government that has been consistent in its resistance to the US-Israeli game in West Asia. So they have to get rid of it. They have to get rid of the government in Damascus because of its resistance, because of its link to Hezbollah, because of its link to Iran. And that's what's happening before our very eyes. There is yet another dimension, friends, to 9/11, one of the other consequences. 9/11 has created a security syndrome that we have not seen before. It has become such an obsession, a security syndrome which denies human rights to people everywhere, in the West, in the East, the North, the South, a security syndrome which has diverted scarce resources from genuine, meaningful economic development to this thing called security, maintaining your security apparatus. A security syndrome whose outstanding characteristic is secrecy. As all security apparatuses, they are linked to secrecy, and that secrecy climaxed in the way in which the US SEALs killed Osama bin Laden. They killed the man and ensured that there would not be any trace of even his grave. And one wonders why. You believe in the rule of law. You believe in the judicial system. Why didn't you put him on trial? It would have been so easy to capture him and put him on trial. But they didn't want to do it because they had something to hide as far as 9/11 is concerned and what had really happened. And this brings me to yet another point about 9/11. Right from the beginning, many of us had observed that the underlying causes of terror and violence, if this was their concern, had not been addressed at all. And to this day, they don't want to address these issues because it doesn't serve their hegemonic interest to address the underlying causes. So friends, you have a situation where 9/11 has succeeded, in a sense, in tarnishing an entire civilization, in creating an artificial security syndrome, in legitimizing conquest and hegemony. Which is why those of us who look at events from the perspective of motives, if these are the motives, we ask ourselves, wasn't this a false flag operation? Because the motives seem to suggest that it was done deliberately, planned, contrived, implemented with certain goals in mind. A false flag operation. A lot of people find it very difficult, friends, to accept this sort of argument. How can it be a false flag operation? How can this be invented, manufactured? Are you accusing the government of doing this? Are you accusing the Israelis of doing this? How can you do this? This, I think, is the biggest psychological obstacle that we face when we tell people that there's something else behind 9/11. If I may, friends, let me, in my conclusion, draw your attention to a number of other false flag operations. We only came to know that these were false flag operations long after the event had happened. The most famous would be the Gulf of Tonkin incident of 1964. The US leadership at that time, Lyndon B. Johnson was the president, actually invented the Gulf of Tonkin incident. They alleged that US planes were being shot at by the Vietnamese. And that became the justification for a resolution in Congress known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution that gave the green light to Lyndon Johnson to begin the carpet bombing of Vietnam. And we know from records that have been made public after that, including biographies and autobiographies, that the whole thing was an invention to justify the carpet bombing of Vietnam and controlling the politics of this region. Look at another example, more recent. What happened in 1990, 1991, when Saddam Hussein's troops invaded Kuwait? There was a story that went around that Iraqi soldiers had entered a Kuwaiti hospital, plucked babies, newborn babies from their incubators, and chucked them on the floor of the hospital. It was a lie. The whole thing was a total lie. The person who gave this so-called evidence before the US Congress, which later voted to go to war against Iraq, the person who gave that evidence was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to Washington, acting as a nurse, giving evidence before Congress. This had happened. Look at the Hola massacre, very recent, what had happened in Syria. We know that it was a massacre committed by the other side. They put the blame on Bashar al-Assad's soldiers. The BBC carried this story as their footage. They used footage from Iraq. 4 days later, after they were exposed, the BBC offered a mild apology. So let us not think that the powers that be, this superpower, is not capable of doing certain things. They've done it before, they're doing it now, they'll do it in the future. Which is why, friends, it is so important to expose the truth about 9/11. It's going to be much more difficult than any of the other episodes that we have talked about, because the question of 9/11 hits at the very heart of global hegemonic power and the structure that maintains that power, which includes Israel and Zionism. Which is why there'll be tremendous opposition to any attempt of this sort. But we have to do it. We have to do it because we owe it, friends, to the millions who have died as a result of the war on terror. The millions who have died in Afghanistan, in Iraq, along the Afghan-Pakistan border, everywhere. We owe it to ourselves because we know this is a monstrous lie. This is an example of a fabrication that has perhaps no other parallel or precedent. We have to fight this. We have to expose this. We have to do it, friends, because we are human beings and we owe it to our conscience. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chandra Muzaffar, for your Asian insight of the 7 pillars of the consequences of the 9/11. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of our presentation. May I remind to all of you today, or alert to you, that His Excellency Tun Dr. Mahathir, during his time with the Islamic Development Bank, did the Vision Commission, which we were associated. One of the fundamentals of the vision was to counter prevailing Western definition of development, which is just a notion of social economic development. The Islamic development vision was a vision of human dignity, where man is the center of all civilization, and where nations today treat with respect in the acquisition, in the pursuit of happiness and success on our life. Today we're talking about global peace and relations among nations and those entrusted with the power to rule the world. I'm sure this morning and this afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, mankind has been confounded till today by the word called 911. In America, in 911 is an emergency call for those who studied in America, of which I had the distinction to be with Madam from America, from USC Trojan. Today, they have invented a global nightmare. But I'm sure, as what that Dr. Mahathir mentioned, the East is also where the sun rises. So daylight is there for those in this room and those outside with our friends from Europe, from America, from Latin America, from Middle East to speak that we shall not tolerate, neither we condone, nor we support this web of deceit and the political hitman spinning that we have witnessed this morning and this afternoon. I am sure to our representative United Nations, which are in front here, that all mankind hope for you, sir, that the United Nations will not be a nation united only from false front, but might have the courage to bring the civilization order of tomorrow. We cannot allow United Nations become undemocratic through the powers today. Today, the rules of democracy have changed, not only through might and money. Today, we must call, which I think the panel have said, that morality and mind must conquer might and money, but use the right technology that we have today. And therefore, I will have this opportunity, another 20 minutes, to open the house for your questions. Please direct your question, one question each, please, and use the best of it all. Yes, please mention your name.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Lim Kim Pim from UM.
All right.
So the world is not in peace because the United Nations cannot function properly as an independent body and with no power. United Nations was formed by the European country after Second World War. European nation controlled the United Nations, which become ineffective world body. I think the veto power for the few European countries and China must be abolished so that all resolutions can be passed by majority of vote. With veto power, anything that affects the interest of European will be vetoed. European country consists of over 20 countries. Second world and third world consists of 200 countries. If any resolution were to be passed by majority of vote, Europeans will lose their interest to the third world country. For United Nations to be strong, independent, and effective world body, all veto power must be abolished and replaced by majority of votes of all the United Nations members. First world was a League of Nations, not effective, and replaced with United Nations. Once Third World War started, United Nations will be abolished to form a new world body. How many times keep on changing world body will not be